Welcome into Mock Trial Masterclass, your guide to controlling the courtroom. I'm Luke and I want you to be a mock trial master. Let's talk about how you can make that happen. Over the last few years, one of the most popular topics in the mock trial world has been invention of fact, or as some people call it, unfair extrapolation. And what that simply means is when a team, usually on direct examination, has a witness really make things up that aren't included in their witness statement, and as a result puts the other team in a tough spot. When it's done that way, invention of fact is straight up cheating. And in fact, just a few years ago, Yale, who for the moment won the national title, had that national title revoked because they were cheating. They invented fact in the national championship round. It's a really, really serious thing. And in a lot of tournaments, I've heard stories of folks out there like y'all enduring this and asking the question of, what do I do when the other team is just making stuff up that's not in the trial packet? What do I do to respond to invention of fact? Well, that's exactly what we're going to go over in this video. I'm going to share with you 3 things I think you should keep in mind as you're responding to invention of fact. We're going to talk about some strategies. We're going to talk a little bit about when to respond and when not to respond. We're going to talk about how to do it effectively, because I've watched a lot of mock trial, I've competed in a lot of mock trial, and I've seen a lot of invention of fact, unfortunately. And what I've also seen is teams respond really well to it and do a great job of pointing out that the other side was a bunch of cheaters, and respond really poorly to it and sort of succumb to the cheating, unfortunately. And so what I hope you're going to get out of this video is that you won't be on this side of things, that instead you'll be on the other side, knowing how to respond well, knowing how to respond effectively, and handle it on your own. So, you ready to hop in? Let's do it. So the first thing I want to teach you about responding to an invention of fact is that you should not make an objection to an invention of fact. Way too often, especially in high school, I see mock trial competitors respond to an invention of fact by objecting and saying something along the lines of, objection, this is an invention of fact, or objection, this is outside the mock trial universe, or this is outside the scope of the problem, right? Any number of those types of objections. I've seen them all. You've probably seen them all, again, especially in the high school world. And what I'm here to tell you is that that is a horrible way to handle this situation. Because if you've ever listened to this channel before, if you've read my book, you know I believe that the single most important thing to do in mock trial is to control the courtroom, to show the scores that you're in control of the courtroom, right? It's why I open every episode of Mock Trial Masterclass by saying, I want to teach you how to control the courtroom. Well, when you handle an invention of fact by objecting and sort of throwing things to the judge instead of taking care of it yourself in the way that we're going to talk about in a minute, you're giving up control of the courtroom. What you're doing in that situation is you're saying, I have the control, right? And even though they're cheating over there, I have the control, I have control in my hand, and I'm just going to throw it at the judge and give it up. And we don't want to do that, because here's the thing. The judge might not quite understand the rules of your competition. The judge might think the rule of your competition is one thing when it's actually another as it relates to invention of fact, and you don't always have time to teach them correctly, and you're probably not going to convince them otherwise. It gets really muddy, and this isn't a rule that they would have learned in law school, right? We're not talking about a real rule of evidence like hearsay or relevance or improper character evidence, and so you're probably just going to confuse the judge, and it's not going to go your way. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen that objection get made, right? An objection, invention of fact, objection outside the universe, and nothing happens when it absolutely should have happened. And my guess is that if the attorney had, instead of objecting, handled it another way that we're going to talk about in a second, things might have gone a little bit better for them. So, don't make the objection. There's a much better way to do this. Keep the control with yourself. Control the courtroom yourself, right? Don't let the judge have to do it for you. So you're probably sitting there asking, well, what do I do instead of making the objection? Let's talk about that. So I told you at the beginning I had 3 things I wanted to teach you about responding to invention of fact. The first is that you don't make an objection, right? The second thing I want to teach you is how to handle it, which is with an impeachment. Now, when we talk about impeachment in mock trial, we're not talking about like when you impeach a president and if it's successful, they get thrown out of office, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're not throwing anybody off the witness stand. When you impeach a witness in mock trial, you're bringing up usually a prior inconsistent statement of that witness. In other words, something they said in the past that is inconsistent with something they're saying on the witness stand, in effect to prove that they're a liar. Well, sometimes we do what's called an impeachment by omission, which is when instead of saying, you said this thing in the past and that's different than what you're saying now, what you do with an impeachment by omission is saying, hey, I have your witness statement or something else you did in the past, and what you're saying right now is not in there anywhere. In other words, it's omitted from what's there in the past. And what you're doing in effect in that situation is you're proving still that they're a liar because of the fact that either A, they hid something before and they're just springing it at you now, or B, on the other hand, this is all just being made up in the moment. Now, I have another video on my channel that teaches you how to make great impeachments, and we talk about how to make normal impeachments and impeachments by omission. Again, something that was omitted, that was left out before. So go check out that video. I'll leave a link in the description and in the show notes on podcast platforms for where you can find that video. We won't go over the steps of an impeachment, but what you need to know as it relates to invention of fact is that impeachment is the way to handle it. Because here's the thing, when you make an impeachment, instead of making the objection, and you're able to walk up to the witness and say, now, Mr. and Mrs. Witness, you're saying this thing right now on the witness stand, but I have your witness statement that you wrote before that was sworn to, that you said you were going to uphold and all these things. And nothing that you're talking about right here is anywhere in that. Right? When you're able to do that and have that big of a theatrical moment, instead of relying on the judge to save the day, you maintain control of the courtroom. Number one, right? It stays on your shoulder. And suddenly, not only are you pointing out that the other side is cheating, not only are you taking care of their invention of fact and handling it, it's a huge performance moment for you that's going to make your score go up. Now, you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, what if the invention of fact is such that I can't really impeach on it? It's just not a big enough deal for me to impeach. Then it probably wasn't an invention of fact. See, I hear a lot of the outside the universe and outside the scope objections to stuff that really isn't even an invention of fact, because the reality is that most competitions, certainly at the college and high school level, give you a little bit of leeway as for things you can tweak a little bit in your witness statement. You can't make up huge stuff. You can't make up huge deals. You can't, bring up facts that are going to, as they would say, materially alter the case. But you have a little bit of wiggle room. And so if you're in a situation, you're saying, man, they're inventing fact, but it's not big enough for me to be able to impeach on them, then they're not really inventing fact, right? So the correct way to handle an invention of fact is not with an objection, but instead with an impeachment. All right, I've got one more tip for you when it comes to responding to inventions of fact. But first, I want to remind you that my book, Mock Trial Masterclass, is available on Amazon. And guys, there's a section on this book where I cover this exact topic, responding to invention of fact. But my guess is that there's a lot more in mock trial you'd like to learn about than just this one specific issue. And the good news is I cover all of those things as well in this book. Everything from direct examination to cross-examination, witness performances, opening statement, closing arguments, impeachments, objections, rules of evidence, all of that is covered in my book. I try to put everything I've learned in my many years of competing in and coaching mock trial into this guide to be a resource for you all, for your teams, if you're a coach, for you too, to take yourself, take your team, your performance to the next level. And if you want to pick up a copy, you can click the link in the description on YouTube or in the show notes on podcast platforms. Okay, my last tip for handling inventions of fact, and we already talked about it a little bit, is don't do anything if it's not that big of a deal. Because here's the thing about an invention of fact. Yes, it may technically at some point the other side is cheating and they shouldn't be doing that. But if it's not actually affecting you, if it's not actually affecting the trial, let's not make a big deal about it. Because again, we never want to object, right? That takes control away from us. It puts it in the hands of the judge. We do want to impeach. Well, here's the thing about an impeachment is that it takes time. And mock trial is a timed activity. Now, if the other side is doing such a bad invention of fact that you can effectively impeach and it's going to make you look really good and it's going to expose them for the frauds and the cheaters that they are, right? Absolutely go for it. Go head first for it. I want you to do that. But if you're in a situation where the other side is just kind of like waffling on the truth a little bit and it's not really that big of a deal and it's not central to the case, like I tend to think we can probably move on in those situations. So let me give you an example, right? If a witness on the stand is recounting a story of a crime that took place and they misidentify the type of clothing that some random stranger was wearing. In other words, maybe they're like, well, the guy who did the thing that we're talking about here, he was over here. Now over there was someone and they were wearing a red shirt and maybe they were actually wearing a purple shirt. Who cares, right? Maybe the person on the witness stand forgot and it's not really that big of a deal. Maybe they did make it up. Maybe it wasn't in the case, but really who cares? This person is inconsequential to the case. It don't really matter much, right? We can move on from that. Just stay seated. Don't do anything crazy. But if that error came when they were describing the person who committed the crime, and it's maybe like a really big deal in the case that they were wearing red and the person said they were wearing purple or vice versa, it's time to pounce now. Because in that situation, it matters. And there's probably a good chance, even if it was just an honest mistake, that the other team could wind up using that in their favor. So just keep that in mind when you're responding to invention of fact. Not every little alteration or tweak to what was actually in the case packet is worth this big response where you get really upset and, oh, no. And that's another thing to remember too. Don't get emotional during these situations, right? It's really easy to get angry and upset because, they're breaking the rules and they're cheating, right? I get that. I've been there. I have done this, right? It's why I'm telling you it doesn't work, because I've done it and it didn't work for me. And if you do it, it's not going to work for you. So don't get emotional when these situations come up. Take a deep breath, right? Pause. Follow the steps of an impeachment that I talk about in my impeachment video, right? And then if it's not that big of a deal, if it's not going to affect you, if it's not going to affect the case, then forget about it. It might be really hard. And you might be, I'm not going to let them get away with this. Just let them get away with it, right? If it's not that big a deal, it's not that big a deal. And you just need to move on and save the time and take a big, deep breath. I understand that this has been a really controversial topic in the mock trial world lately, so I'm curious if you have any comments, if you have any other thoughts that you would like to share, please leave them in the comment section below. Leave a response to the Q&A if you're listening on Spotify or on a podcast platforms. I would love to hear what you guys think on this topic, but this is how I tend to think about it. This is how I teach my students to respond to invention of fact. And I'd love to hear stories, right? If you've got an invention of fact story of some team doing some awful thing to you, let me know. I love reading those too. But if you follow these steps, I really do think that you're going to be able to respond and handle these invention of fact situations effectively. I hope one doesn't come up for you. I hope you don't have to deal with them. But if you do, I think you're going to be in a position to handle it like a mock trial master.